After Virtue, Chapter 5. So Kierkegaard, Kant, Diderot, and Hume failed to create a system of morality independent of Christianity. Okay, well, maybe they were not smart enough or not clever enough. Just because they failed to do so, it doesn't mean that it can't be done. MacIntyre claims that they failed because a project at its root, in its essence, is impossible. Failure is inevitable. The project is doomed from the very beginning. The very question itself is impossible and will fail, no matter how smart you are. Well, why? Because he would argue that traditional morality is Aristotelian and Catholic, or Christian, but mostly Catholic. Now, Aristotle's morality has three parts. Number one, human beings as they are. Okay, that's part one. Human beings as they are. They come out as they are, untutored, unshaped, and raw. Number one. Number two, an ethical system of morality that is rational and discoverable, like the law of gravity or mathematics. This moral system is universal and timeless, right? Part three, human beings as they could be, okay? They will be something better once they have been trained in this ethical system. All right, so part one, human beings as they are, untutored, raw, unshaped, that's just what you are. They encounter part two, an ethical moral system that is rooted in reason. It's in nature, it's rational and discoverable, like the law of gravity. And then part one plus part two gets you part three, a human being as they could be, their full potential mastered and realized. Someone who is rational, reasonable, educated, and trained in the ethical system. Okay, all these three elements have to work together to make some kind of coherent sense. This was Aristotle's system, and then later on it got Christianized. There are some important elements to this ethical system that Alasdair MacIntyre describes. Number one, human nature. We are rational animals. That is our essence. That's human nature. Meaning we are happiest, we are most fulfilled, we're most satisfied when we embody fully our reasonable nature. We are born with a reasonable potential, and the potential has to be realized. Point number two, the telos, or the proper ends of what we are, or what anything is. For example, the acorn yearns and strives to be a mighty oak tree. It is a proper end of an acorn to be a mighty, robust oak tree. Likewise, a human being does not come to the world fully, ethically, rationally formed and properly educated and shaped. Okay, but the rational potential, or the seed, or acorn, lies in his or her being. And if society will nurture that rational seed in his or her being, then it will flourish, and you will end up with a human being as he or she could be. That potential is fulfilled, a fully rational and also ethical being. So man is a rational being. So he is fully fulfilled, satisfied, and happy once he fulfills his nature, or it's his intended purpose. A fully formed and properly shaped person is rational and ethical, the telos. Meaning some people don't have that rational essence fully developed, and they may not become the telos, but they'll spend the rest of their lives being frustrated because we yearn to be rational. We just don't know it. And if you're not rational or ethical, then you're just upset. You're frustrated because you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing. This moral system is discoverable by reason. Like gravity or mathematics, if you're a smart person and you have skills of observation, you'll figure it out. We will eventually figure this out. It's also given to us by God, by natural and special revelation. That's when Aristotelianism becomes Christianized. Okay, so why did the Enlightenment moral project fail? Why did these Enlightenment philosophers fail to discover a moral system apart from Christianity? They don't, in various ways, have all three elements working together. Mostly, they don't have God. They don't have a telos. Also, they don't tend to have an ought. One could say this is marriage, the nature of marriage, right? But can you make me faithful to my wife? Okay, you could explain why I ought to be faithful to my wife. No, but can you compel me to be faithful to my wife? No, not really. Okay, again, you could describe the nature of marriage. You can argue the reasonable nature of marriage. You can talk about why I ought to be faithful, but you can't compel me to be faithful to my wife. In the Enlightenment world, reason and ought have been severed. MacIntyre brings up a philosopher named A.N. Pryor, who's a 20th century philosopher. He tried to argue for an ought. He tried to argue for a secular morality. For example, you can like define a ship captain, right? The ship captain has a role. And so then you can say because of his role, his function, this ship captain ought to function as a good ship captain. The ought is connected to his function. Likewise, a watch, the kind of, you look at it to tell time. It has a function, which is it tells time. A watch is good for telling time. Therefore, we can judge the degree to which a watch tells time accurately. And a watch is good for telling time, and if it can tell time properly, then it's a good watch. A watch is not necessarily good for throwing in a cat. That's not a function of a watch, so we don't really judge it by those standards. So the philosopher A.N. Pryor has created a philosophical system of ethics that connects reason with ethics. Okay, once again, the Enlightenment philosophers are good at describing things, but they can never create a compelling reason why you ought to actually do something. So A.N. Pryor thinks he's figured out a way that, you can describe something like a scientist, and from that derive the ought, how you ought to act. Again, ship captain ought to act like a ship captain. It's based on function, and then you judge someone morally, shake your finger at them that you failed to function as you were properly supposed to, based on your function in the world. And yet, I think A.N. Pryor also fails in his project, like the other Enlightenment philosophers. And herein lies a problem. We judge based on function, okay? The ought comes from function. But the function is rooted in a community. A function is also rooted in a telos. The community decides what my function is, and my ought comes from my function. Here's a problem, though. A hallmark of modernity is that I am liberated from my past, my community, my history, my family. I am an autonomous, self-defining being. So how can there be any sort of universal binding morality on me if my function comes from my community and I actually reject my community? That is a hallmark of modernity. I'm a self-defining being. Therefore, how can you actually put a universal moral claim on me? Once again, that fails too, all right?